The Nintendo Game Boy was an absolute game changer in the video game industry. For the first time, an actual quality gaming experience could go with you anywhere. You didn't have to have a console hooked up to a TV or plant yourself in front of an arcade machine. Your gaming experience was now wherever you wanted it to be. And as so often is the case with video games, you just don't quite have the full experience without a killer soundtrack to go with it all. While there were undoubtedly a huge amount of technical limitations with this pioneer of portable gaming, there still managed to be an incredibly impressive amount of quality games and, more importantly to this video, quality soundtracks. With nearly 800 games in its library, you knew there had to be a whole bunch of gems out there, and this is the best of the best with my personal top 10 soundtracks on the Nintendo Game Boy. Let's start this list off in the exact same place almost every one of us started off our own experience with the Game Boy. Tetris is a game that somewhat retained a lot of the older arcade-style gaming, despite its Game Boy coming of age taking place after games had gone a significant evolution with the Nintendo Entertainment System. A high score was still your objective with Tetris, as was pretty much always the case with arcade games prior to the platforming era. But I think a big part of what kept Tetris relevant was having a soundtrack that, by previous arcade standards at least, was decently in-depth. Now, I know that by pretty much any standard of its time, the Game Boy Tetris soundtrack didn't have much depth, but that's what makes Tetris somewhat of a bridge between old school and newer school for that era. But even with just a few really high-quality tracks, and given their undeniable place in the Game Boy's history, it's good enough to occupy a top 10 spot on this list. As an overall game, TMNT 2 Back from the Sewers isn't that good. It's pretty much a straight line of occasionally attacking with timing that isn't anything at all difficult to nail down. But that doesn't stop it from still being fun for at least a little while, one, because it's Ninja Turtles, but more so because this game has an awesome soundtrack. It's got a lot of solid songs that are really fitting to everything that Ninja Turtles were in the early 1990s. Almost any of these songs seem like they could seamlessly transition into scenes from the cartoon, if taken out of their chiptune format, of course. But maybe more so than anything else, the music to this game almost feels like it all ties in with the progression of the game, as things start out strong, lighten up a tad at one point, but then continually build up the suspense as the later stages come along. Not too shabby for a game that is otherwise pretty shabby. Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow is as classic as can be. Just try picturing yourself as an innocent, naive little kid who thinks they're big enough to take on the world. Now put that attitude to music, and you've got the soundtrack to the original Pokemon games. From the innocence of the baby cradle that is Pallet Town to the education that you receive via Professor Oak, and onto the I'm actually doing it kind of vibe from the tune to Route 1, this game's soundtrack completely nails setting off on an adventure. And again, like I mentioned before, this is about as classic can be. Sure, most of this soundtrack doesn't have the depth or intricacies that a lot of the great songs on the Game Boy had, and really in general, most of these songs are pretty simplistic. But again, that childlike wonder of setting out to take on the world is gonna come with a relatively simplistic mind for someone so young, so again, that simplicity sort of fits with the theme when it comes to the original Pokemon games. Here's a game starring the face of Nintendo and probably all of video games at this point, which for this handheld adventure took a step away from practically everything familiar within the Mario universe, really with almost nothing from this game carrying over to other Mario games. Even the American version of Super Mario Bros. 2 had its own handful of aspects that carried over to other games. But outside of Princess Daisy being called upon to fill a roster spot for some tennis or kart racing here and there, Super Mario Land pretty much stands alone. And while the game itself drew a thing or two from the original Super Mario Bros. In the way of mushroom and flower power-ups, they blazed an entirely new trail musically with this game, and holy cow did they nail it all. Now, I'm admittedly not a huge fan of this game, as stated in my review of it I did a while back in the early days of this channel, but as I said back then, I'll say again, the music is outright stellar. And as great as the main themes for Worlds 1 and 2 are, the World 4 music is one of the single best songs on the entire Game Boy. It's catchy, it's got quality progression, it goes a long time before it loops, so I guess it's pretty much got everything I've been awarding points for on this list. Musically, Super Mario Land absolutely crushes it. Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge packs a heavy punch with a handful of great tracks and a pretty solidly deep collection of them. Not only are they great start to finish, but they also go for a good length of time before looping, which I think speaks to the overall quality of a composition in a track. For an action game like this, a killer soundtrack can be the difference between a good game and a timeless classic. And this soundtrack sits toward the latter of those two extremes. The music is just so damn good that it almost has you instinctively wanting to speedrun through levels ready to go and get after it all. Even though more often than not, you need to focus and remember to take your time with certain parts if you actually want to beat the game. On top of being one of the best soundtracks on the Game Boy, it's also among the better soundtracks in the entire Castlevania series, which is some pretty lofty praise, but this one is worthy. The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening is pouring over with mystery. From the characters to the dungeons to the entire island where the game is set, everything is mysterious. So obviously you'd need a mysterious yet adventurous soundtrack to accompany it all, and that is exactly what this soundtrack does. But if you go back and listen to it all, especially comparing it to the elite company of gaming music on this list, Link's Awakening soundtrack would seem as somewhat of a mysterious inclusion here. Most tracks don't have a whole lot of complexity to their composition, even if they're at least consistent with that overall lack of complexity found on the rest of the soundtrack. But much like Pokemon Red and Blue a few spots back, this has to be included based on just how brilliantly the soundtrack fits the game itself. Senses of mystery, darkness, and adventure are all significantly amplified by the music that accompanies your surroundings throughout your journey around Koholint Island. Without the music, this game would for sure still be fun, but would be missing so much of its feel. And an adventure game that can make you feel a part of its world? That's the right kind of adventure game. Ninja Gaiden Shadow might not have the deepest of soundtracks, but for the somewhat smaller number of tracks there are, depth runs wild. All the tracks aren't just good, they're great, and part of what makes them so great is that they're all really long tracks. Long as in that they go through a whole lot of song before the track loops back to its beginning and plays all over again. But cool points aren't awarded simply on the length of the tracks, but rather having them be continually excellent and progressing throughout, and that's exactly what these do. There are a couple songs that are pulled from the NES version of Ninja Gaiden, one of which is the theme for one of the stages, and the way it sort of comes in later in the game is an awesome sneak attack of familiarity to the NES counterpart of the Ninja Gaiden series. And to top it all off, your reward for beating the game is possibly the coolest song on the entire soundtrack. Talk about a completion bonus. I debated for a while about including soundtracks on this list that were ported from a game's NES or SNES counterpart, but what I found was that very few of those games actually did much justice to those original soundtracks. Some of them are even outright hack jobs of the original tunes, whereas the Game Boy Mega Man 3 renditions are every bit as good as their NES originals. Sprinkle that in with a couple original pieces unique to the Game Boy Mega Man 3, and we have the obligatory Mega Man game that's almost required on any list of amazing retro gaming music. Now, I get that Mega Man 2 and 5 on the Game Boy delivered their own original soundtracks, and they were both good, but certainly not great in my mind. Mega Man 3, though, took some of the best tracks from the NES versions of Mega Man 3 and 4 and just freaking nailed them. Like I said, you can't have a list of great video game music without Mega Man, and this is the best of the Mega Man games on the Game Boy, maybe even by far. This is pure excellence. From the very second the game's title screen starts up, you can tell this soundtrack has a bit of a different feel about it. The sounds produced to make up the compositions of the Kirby's Dream Land soundtrack felt entirely fresh at the time, and even by the end of the Game Boy's life cycle, still were pretty much unique in a lot of the aspects they had. It's as if this game brought out sound capabilities of the system to do things that nobody else knew it was capable of doing. Seriously, go back and listen to a bunch of Game Boy soundtracks and try and tell me this game doesn't have a distinctly different feel. As for the music itself, Green Greens and Mount DDD alone could practically carry this near the top, but everything else outside those two are great as well. Yes, it's a shorter game and therefore a smaller soundtrack, but to deliver that unique a feel along with a couple of the best songs on the system, just go put on some headphones and play this game. It'll all make sense after that. You probably didn't see this coming to top the list, probably because a lot of you didn't play this game, and that's a damn shame, because this game is absolutely great, and a huge factor in that greatness is the soundtrack. I've given kudos throughout this list for things like the music conveying a sense of adventure, creating a tense environment, being longer compositions before looping, or using more unique overall sounds in their creation. And Final Fantasy Legend 3 has it all. The overworld music, amazing. The boss music, amazing. Both parts of the final boss music, freaking amazing. And all of that without even yet mentioning the theme, to the motherfucking talent. Seriously, go on YouTube and search Final Fantasy Legend 3 talent theme, and you'll see that 7 years ago, somebody else realized full well that this track was deserving of a motherfucking to fully illustrate its excellence. But even just beyond those top handful, all of which are outright incredible, the rest of the soundtrack fits right in line too with everything else that can make a video game soundtrack great. Final Fantasy Legend 3, the Game Boy music title, is yours. Hey everybody, thank you for checking out this video. I'm sure plenty of you probably have a favorite soundtrack or two that you think should have made the list, and if you do, or if you have any other thoughts, please let me hear them in the comments below. Also be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and thank you again for watching.